Hey everybody, so I am going to show you some modeling techniques in Unreal Engine to create some basic architecture. So the first thing I've done is opened up a basic level template here. I've saved my new level inside a levels folder that I placed in my content folder. Right-clicking, new folder, and then in here I made a new level by saying File, New Level, selecting the basic, and then I go to save current level, and I saved it inside that level folder. So when you're starting out, make sure that your scalability settings are on low. So we go over to settings and we go to engine scalability settings, and let's bring them to low. If they might be at epic or cinematic, we want them on low. That's just to make sure your computer is comfortable. Then I want you to go from selection mode up here on the left to modeling. And as soon as we go into the modeling mode, we're presented with a bunch of different basic objects that we can make buildings from. So today we're going to model a Roman aqueduct like this one. I've just searched for Roman architecture and it's brought up a bunch of different things in Google Images, and we're going to create this kind of aqueduct bridge. So if we look at the thing that we're our reference image, you'll note that essentially in its kind of basic form, there's a few key shapes. So we have these pillars, which are essentially long rectangles, and then we have these archways, which are like rectangles with a semicircular cut in the bottom. So let's go ahead and begin on making that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a box for the pillar. So I click on the box, and you'll see when I bring my mouse into the scene, it is connected to this box. So I have a bunch of options here before I drop it. I can change the width, depth, and height here, or I can go ahead and click somewhere on the scene like this, and I can still change the width, depth, and height here, so I can make it a little bit taller. Let's make our pillar 500 units, and click accept. So you can see that the controls have disappeared, but I can still change, I can kind of stretch it or reshape it here on the right-hand side in my details pane. But this is what I want now for my basic pillar. You can also see that it's created an object in my outliner called a box. And I'm going to try to keep things tidy over here. So I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to rename that by going edit, rename. I'm going to call this building 1. And I'm going to rename the box to pillar, because it's not a box anymore, it's a pillar. Rename that to pillar. So now I'm going to duplicate this pillar a couple of times so that I can get my basic structure. So I just press Control C and Control V, and it's copy and pasted it. On a Mac, this would be Command C, Command V. I'm just going to drag the first pillar out. I'm going to use this handy grid on the floor to kind of measure that we want the space in between to be around twice the width of the pillar. So I could continue doing this for as long as I want to create the pillars, but first I'm going to create the most basic form of my complete structure. So I'm going to do that by starting to create the archway. So the basis for the archway, if we look at our shape again, is a rectangle that has a cylinder cut out of the bottom. So how do we do that? Well, we go over to box again, select box, and you can see that it's still in pillar shape like that. So I'm going to just click so I place it somewhere, and then I'm going to resize it over here. So the height, if I go back to the original height, is 100. So let's have a look at our aqueduct again and just say that the width, if this width is 100, then the height from top to bottom is probably twice the width. So I'm going to change the height over here to 200. And I'm going to change the width so that I can roughly cover 50% of my pillar, because if you think we're going to duplicate this along and they're going to kind of fit snugly into each other. So I can determine this by saying the empty space in between is twice the width of the pillar, so that's 200, and then half of 100 is 50, so 2 halves is another 100, so the width is going to be 300. So here we have the top part that's going to sit on top of these pillars, and I'm going to say accept, so it sits there. Now we want to place it on there, and you can see that it's a little bit awkward to try to kind of navigate this viewport and, put it exactly where we want, because we don't have like a really nice angle where we can see it fit exactly in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to this little square with 4 squares inside, and when I click that, I get this multi-view display. And so what's happening here is essentially we have the same scene, but just from a group of fixed angles. So you can see here on the top, it says back, right, top. And so these are in wireframe view, but we can as easily click here and change the view to lit or whatever. This is currently lit, but you see we could also change this to wireframe, and then we would see the same thing. Wireframe is useful because we can kind of see through objects, but if there's a lot going on, it can be a little confusing. Let's keep it on wireframe now, just so we get used to it, and take a look at it from another angle. So when I zoom out, I'm using the right mouse button to click and drag so that I can position my camera. So you can see here, if I click and drag from the top view, it moves it into place, and I can position it exactly on top of my pillars. And I'm going to do the same by moving it down on the y-axis. So that looks good to me. I think that's more or less in the middle. And so I'm going to go back to my main display by clicking on the little square. I can do that to any of these to kind of maximize, highlight one of the particular views. And now I'm going to add a cylinder so that I cut the cylinder out and create the arch. So I'll go over to the cylinder shape. You see when I bring that in, I have like a kind of a plain cylinder, and I'm going to just pop it roughly where I want it to subtract from my rectangle. And I'm going to resize it so that I get the size that I want. Now we know that roughly the width of this empty space is 200. So I'm going to change the radius of my cylinder to 200. Nope, it's a little too big. Change it to 100. Maybe that's what we want. The radius is half of the diameter, so that makes sense that 100 radius would be 200 diameter. So I'm going to place it kind of where I want it, more or less, and I'm going to hit accept so that it's there, even though it's not exactly where we want it yet. I'm going to go back to this multi-view, and I'm going to use this perspective to just make sure it's positioned exactly where the arch is going to be. And then when I'm more or less happy with where it's at, I'm going to just drag it over to completely intersect the top rectangle. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, I have many options here on the left for things that I can do with these models. And if I go over to model, I have this option called Boolean. And Boolean means kind of cutting one shape out of the other. So what I do, you can see it's grayed out right now, but in order to activate it is I need to select two shapes. So I'm going to start by clicking the rectangle that I want to cut things out of, and then press Shift, and I'm going to hit the cylinder. And I'm going to go over and click, you can see it's active now, I'm going to click Boolean. And immediately we see what's going on. This cylinder's been made almost completely transparent, and it's cut a shape out of the top rectangle. So what do we got over here in our options, just so we know? If we got it the wrong way around, and that happens by, that's determined by which object you click first, I can flip it around over here. So now you can see the cylinder is having a thing cut out by the rectangle. And I can control the display and so on. But everything here I can just leave as it is. And I'm going to hit accept. So now the cylinder has completely disappeared, but just its shadow of its former self has cut out the top rectangle. And it's created this shape over here called Boolean, which isn't in my building folder, so I'm going to just drag it and put it in there. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it arch. Okay. So now let's take a look at our aqueduct images again. So we look like we're doing pretty okay, I think. Maybe this is a little tall, but it's okay for now. And I'm going to just duplicate this a few times so that I get a sense of where I'm going. So I'm going to press Command C, Command V with the arch object highlighted. I'm just going to drag it over to the left on its y-axis. And we can see that it fits pretty nice like that. I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom pillar. Control C, Control V, and drag it over. If you want to be 100% precise, you can work out the distance. You can change the location manually over here. But for now, I can pretty much eyeball it. You might want to do that if your models get a little more complex than this. So this is a nice kind of, what would I call this, like base section. You can see if I continue to duplicate this entire section, the right hand piece over here will slot into the left hand over there. So I'm going to group this as one section and duplicate that group. I'm going to do that by selecting all of the pieces in my buildings folder, right clicking and clicking group. And now you can see it's created this box around the entire shape, which I can manipulate as if it were one object by moving it around like that. And similarly, I can copy and paste the entire thing. So if I press Control C, Control V, then I can drag out a second copy of that. And let's do it again. Let's build a bridge that goes somewhat across our game area. Okay, now we have a nice wall of arches. So you can see we have quite a lot going on here in our building folder, but I'm going to clean up the edges first by just clicking one of the sections, right clicking on it, and go to group and say ungroup. So now I can go back and edit the individual pieces. I'm going to just trim off the edges like that. And I want to clean up these, you see it's got this kind of like little bite off the top. And I'm going to clean that up by just duplicating my pillar and dragging it up so that it just overlaps all the shapes and creates a kind of, it fills in the gap. So I press Control C, Control V, and then I'll drag this up like that. Nice. Going to do the same on the other side. Going to ungroup this section by going to groups, ungroup. Going to press, I can go Control C, Control V, and drag this up to fill in that gap. Okay, so nice base wall. Let's take a look at our pieces and make this all one piece. So now I have everything selected. I can right click on it and go group, and I say regroup so that it's still partly a group, but there's more bits in. You can see that there's some funny topography here because we have overlapping shapes. This isn't generally good practice, but it works well for us here, so I'm going to just leave it as it is. Now I'm going to drag this over here. I'm going to duplicate it by pressing Control C, Control V, and I'm going to drag it out like that. So I have a corresponding wall. I'm going to duplicate it again, Control C, Control V. And this time I'm going to rotate my new copy on the Z axis 90 degrees. And I'm going to move it over to join the edges. I'm going to make a little courtyard of aqueduct shapes. Copy it again. At any point, if you press F, you can focus on the thing that you have selected. And I'm going to just put it right where I want it, like that. Okay, nice. We've almost forgotten our second level. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just shift and select everything. I'm going to right click and say regroup. So now this entire thing is one object. I'm going to hit Control C, Control V again to duplicate this entire thing. And this time I'm going to just drag up the second part so that I get it. Let's see our reference image. It's not very tall, the second section, so when I drag it up, I'm going to bring it up about this much. We can expand or contract it as much as we like here. But that looks good to me. Now we could get more detailed and we could add this rectangle here. We could cut out a little shape here for a statue. But for now, this seems to serve my purpose pretty nicely. The next thing I'm going to do is create an interior space. So I want to show you a few ways to do that. One way is to create a box and then create a box within the box so that we can walk inside it. So let's do that first. I'll go over to create, I'll go to box, and I'll drop a box over here. And then I'm going to resize this a little bit. So I'm going to make it about, let's say 1,000. And by 1,000, I'll make the height 500. And I think that's probably a good enough size. I might make the height a little higher than that, so 800. And then I'm going to find this shape. I'm going to say accept. Find this shape over in my outliner. I'm going to close building 1. I'm going to make another folder called building 2. And I'm going to drag this, this new shape into the building 2 folder. I'm going to rename it outer, let's call it a house. And then I'm going to duplicate this, Control C, Control V, and I'm going to rename the second object. I'm going to rename it to inner house. And so the reason why I'm doing this is if we were to just have an object like this, when we go inside it, you see it disappears. And the reason for that is that Unreal Engine only renders one side of a shape. If it were to render the side that you cannot see, the other side of this cube, for example, then it would be wasting some of its CPU, some of its processing power. And so if we go inside this box, we're going to just see nothing. And so what we want to do is create an inner shape. So I'm going to use this inner house as the interior walls of my building. So let's go to wireframe view. And I'm going to scale the inner house down a little bit. I'll go to my scale tool, drag the center, and just make it a little smaller. Now, you'll see that it's made it quite a lot smaller, like too much smaller. There's a lot of kind of wasted negative space there. So why that's happening is that all up here we have different controls for our snapping. And so snapping is essentially an invisible grid inside our workspace where all the objects will kind of align on the grid. We can turn this on and off by turning on and off snapping. Enables or disables snapping objects to scale. So if I turn this off, now you'll see I can really just put it anywhere I want. But I can also change how much how big the invisible grid is by let's turn it on, by clicking on here. You can see scale snap. So right now it's at 0.25, and what this relates to is the units. So you can see that if I scale this down, if you look over at the scale details over here, it's at 1, and if I scale it down 1, it's at 0.75, meaning it subtracted 0.25 from the scale. Let's change this to something like 0.1. And now you can see it's a much smaller decrease. It's actually probably quite a lot still, but I think that's enough for a wall. That looks like a sturdy wall. So I'm going to just now go back to lit, and I'm going to select my outer house, and then I'm going to shift, select my inner house, and I'll go over to that tool that we used earlier to make the arch. I'll go over to the Boolean tool, click Boolean, and then click accept. So you can see nothing happens because we have no way into our cube. But if we just scroll in, you can see there's an inner space now, where previously we could just see directly through the wall. And now we want to cut a door in here. So let's just make a simple door by creating another cube. I'm going to go to create box. And you remember it's very big because this was the shape of our building. I'm going to just click it, and I'm going to make it much smaller by going width, say 200, and depth, say 300, and then height, something like 300. So that's probably good. I'm going to drag it over so that it intersects with the wall. I'm going to say accept, and now I can tell that it's like really going into the cube, the main building cube. So I'm going to select my building, then press shift, select the what's going to be the door cube, this new cube that I made, and I'm going to go over to model, Boolean, and you can see now it's going to cut that cube out of the wall. So I can change this at any point by moving it around here. I can rescale it, I can make sure it's in the right place. And then when I'm happy with it, I click accept. All right. So let's just play our game for a second and see what this looks like. Oh, I'm going to clean up here first. We have this Boolean, so this is our building. I'm just going to call this house. See, we named it inner house and outer house, but when we applied the Boolean modifier, it changed the name. So I'm going to edit, rename house. And I'm going to drag that over into building 2 to keep my folders nice and tidy. So hit play, and here we have our character, and we're in this courtyard of Roman aqueducts. And I can run into my house shape like that. Now, you might want to put windows in here, which you would do by cutting a hole the exact same way as the door. So I challenge you to do that with your building. Make sure there's some windows, skylights, whatever else you want. One last thing I wanted to show you is these extrude path and extrude polygon tools over here in the create shapes. So extrude polygon is pretty nice. We can just draw a shape on the ground, any shape we want. And when we join it, when we create a complete circuit, it becomes a shape that we can then, using our mouse, just bring up and down. And once we're happy with its scale or position, we just click and it locks it into place, and we've created a shape like that. When you're happy, you can change some details here, but when you're happy, you can just say complete. And similarly, we have this tool called extrude path. And so extrude path allows us to build interior spaces pretty easily. So I'll find a bit of space for us to work over here. And you'll see that I can just click and point to point make this green line. And I will join it together. And then when the next thing is that when I move the mouse, it creates a wider or narrower, what's going to be a wall. Let's make it about that thick. When I click and then I move the mouse up, you can see it's extruding up this another kind of a courtyard or a kind of walled garden area. And then when I click to finish, it just sets it wherever I like. So this is another way to build what essentially could be an interior space. You could put a roof on that or leave it open as you like. And then when you want to make a door or whatever, you just do the same thing as we did for the door in our building. So I'm going to say complete. And these are various objects that we have created through modeling with the basic Greyboxing tools in Unreal Engine. You can continue to explore. So for example, we can change some of the options here. So for example, if I go to deform, I can go to warp, and I can just kind of squeeze and move this around like that. So let's see what that looks like. Or I can change what's called lattice. So I can drag these points and it will deform my shape based on the surrounding lattice. Lattice is like scaffolding. So that's one way that maybe I could create an entrance to this shape by just dragging down one of the corners. Hit accept, press accept. And now I press play and I can run over to my shape like that. All right. So keep playing with that, explore all of these different options, and create something beautiful.